Okay, so now let's go to the analysis part. From the time I was 9 years old, I wanted to be in the space program. I was fascinated by it. My parents are immigrants from Greece. My father got to this country in time to get drafted and get sent to the Panama Canal Zone to start to secure the canal zone after Pearl Harbor, assuming the Japanese were going to bomb it next. And then made it back up north in time to, my mother's family had lived across the street from where his brother was living in New York City and where he was staying. Met my mother, they got married, and he shipped over here to be able to land on Omaha Beach and go through France and Germany. So he finally gets out of the war. And even though he'd started university in Greece, there's no way he was going to go back and do that. He now was married. And he did what every Greek male on that side of the Atlantic that I knew or have ever known in those days did. He went into the restaurant business. My father was a waiter for most of his life, worked from 3 in the afternoon to 3 in the morning, 7 days a week. And that becomes very important because 3 times, as I mentioned, in elementary school, various parts of the school system decided that I was cognitively slow and that I needed to be left back. It started out when I was 6 because we'd spent 4 months in Greece and I could speak Greek, and I spoke English with a Greek accent, and I could read Greek, but I couldn't read English. And in 1950, that was seen as signs of mental retardation. Not a lot of multiculturalism. So all this is going on, and it doesn't happen until I'm about in 6th grade when there's this massive event that shakes the United States of America to the core, and that was the launch of Sputnik. You have no idea what it did. Every student in every school system was tested that year, and they were looking for people who were good in physics and math. Turned out I'm really good in physics and math. So I got into an experimental program, and the next thing I know, I got into MIT and the exact program I wanted to be in to build spaceships. And that was my specialty, was control systems of interplanetary vehicles. But I ran out of money by the end of my 3rd year because I had taken out so many loans, the federal government intervened and said, you can't have any more loans. My parents could give me a few $100s a year, and between scholarships and the money I'd saved working band jobs and in restaurants, I still didn't have enough. So I got a job, MIT got me a job at Northrop Noir in experimental gas dynamics research. I was designing what later was supposed to be the interstellar interplanetary shuttle. It turns out we lost the contract to Boeing. But the important issue is that by doing this work for 6.5 months, I could earn enough money and I could finish. But the effect it had on me was quite the opposite. What I learned from doing that is there was no way I was going to do that for the rest of my life because it was boring. I mean, we sat, it was, I don't know if you ever watched this American TV show called Big Bang Theory, but it was like 2 departments of Sheldon's. And we sat in our cubicles and wrote computer programs. I was in charge of figuring out what kind of window portal would be on the reentry vehicle, and then running tests to show what would happen at the maximum heat point at reentry. So there were 2 weeks of my life that I had generated the data for this proposed portal shape, and I had to put 900 points of data on an 11-inch by 17-inch piece of vellum graph paper, and then connect the dots, because this is before computer graphics. That was 2 weeks of my life, Monday through Friday, for 2 weeks. At the end of that, I said, this is crazy. So I went back to MIT. I'm much too conscientious and compulsive not to finish. I only had a couple courses left, I did. But I went to sign up for some other courses because I said, what am I going to do? I don't want to go in the restaurant business. I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. I kind of started losing my juice as a Greek Orthodox, so I kind of was off going into the priesthood. I knew that I loved music and I could, help people dance and enjoy themselves, but I wasn't that good to do it. So I said, I got it, I'll be a manager. It's got to be easy. Look at all these people at Northrop. We had 2 managers in charge of all of these Sheldons who created an environment in which the most exciting thing we talked about each day was where we were going to go for lunch. So MIT had this thing where if you didn't have prerequisites, they had professors stand up and describe their courses that you could take. And one of them was described by this very young fellow who was just finishing his PhD, hadn't finished it at Harvard yet in psychology, David Kolb. Some of you know because of experiential learning theory and all that. And Dave described his course. And his course was on something that sounded like utter crap to me. It was organizational psychology. I couldn't think of something stupider. But in his description, he said 2 words that made me literally run to the basement to his classroom and get in because everything was oversubscribed, so first come, first serve. And those 2 words were no tests. No, I just want you to appreciate the fact that a major course in your life can happen on the basis of something that sounds irrelevant. So in the course, you know, we're talking about change, and I'm talking about that. I want to do my paper on how managers don't help their subordinates. And he said, we have data on how graduate students at MIT help or don't help each other. Would you like to use real data instead of just a kind of observational paper? I said, sure. I killed myself for the next 2 months. He liked what I did. He hired me for the summer. And then the next fall, he got me into a bunch of doctoral seminars. So all of a sudden, I'm studying adult socialization with people who seemed interesting to me, but I wasn't in the field, so I didn't know that Ed Schein was a master player. I didn't know that Dave McClellan in social change was an internationally famous person. I didn't know that Everett Hagen was the person who had started the Psychoanalytic Historical Society with Erik Erikson. So I'm taking courses with the doctoral courses. They are on my list, and they then convinced me to go to graduate school. I didn't have any money, but they pointed out that graduate schools typically either help you get jobs, teaching and other things, or you get fellowships. So the next thing I know, I'm in a PhD program at Harvard. And I should say that my father lived for about 3 years after I finished my PhD in psychology at Harvard. And by then, the family had moved up to Boston from New York, and he'd introduced me to his Greek friends at the church, the Greek Orthodox Church in Brockton, Mass, as his son who got a degree in engineering from MIT. He always left off the PhD because it was in psychology, which the Greek word, if you know any Greek, is saklamatis, which means foolishness. The other thing is, MIT was a righteous place to get an education. It was a place that immigrants who are really trying to better themselves should go. Whereas Harvard was this den of leftist pinko thought. It still is, but that's another issue. At any rate, I've been working on this theory since spring of 1967. The early version of it, Dave Kolb and I worked on together, and then over the decades, I just did a lot more of it by myself with a lot of other colleagues and students. And it all comes down to the fact that humans do not change in linear or continuous ways. So this group looks pretty fit, so I won't talk about what happens if people are volume challenged. But if you know somebody who's volume challenged, you know you don't lose a half a pound a day. Some days you lose a pound, some days you gain a pound. Or what's a bigger issue around here is cigarette smoking. You know, it's the one guaranteed way, you know, you can get one of 5 different forms of cancer. So do you smoke half a cigarette less a day? So what ends up happening is, if change is discontinuous and we don't notice that we're changing in a smooth way, we start to feel uneasy about ourselves and we stop the change process. If we're watching somebody else and we don't think they're making enough progress, they're picking it up. So this issue is not a simple issue. People change in discontinuous pops. I started using complexity theory to describe it in 1978. And what it says is that those of us who do the longitudinal research and really follow people for years, if not decades, find that there are always 5 key experiences or discoveries that are central. One is, what kind of person do you want to be? What do you want out of life? Some sense of the dream or your vision, not goals necessarily, dream or vision. If you have that, you're eligible for the second. If you don't, there's a 5% chance you'll get there. If you have it, then you start to think about how you come across to others, which is what I call the real self, not what you think of yourself. And the comparison to the output of this is a vision statement, the output of this is a personal balance sheet. Here, it's a learning agenda, the third discovery. And this isn't a performance improvement plan. This is something you are joyfully excited about trying and working on. The fourth discovery is experimentation and practice with new thoughts, feelings, behaviors. And the fifth is building these caring relationships. Now, what did it have to do with the stories that you remembered? We started doing research on this in 2002 and collecting from samples of folks in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the same question I asked you. And then we would have them spend about an hour on it, and then we would interview them for 2 hours. 80 to 100% of every sample we looked at, when we said, tell me about someone who helped you the most, comes back with a story. And I wouldn't be surprised if most of you thought about your mother or father, or a conversation with a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, in which they didn't say, well, you're a girl, you should be a nurse. It was, have you considered? It was a conversation that opened you up. Or sometimes it was through observing. You know, when we moved out to Long Island, we got my parents wanted to have a little house, and we got a little house. And I remember one time in June, must have been about 11, I'm going downstairs to the kitchen to see if I can get a cookie. My mother's on her hands and knees, scrubbing the linoleum on the floor, trying to get it clean, the really stiff brush. And our next door neighbor, Barbara Menarchio, comes over. And it was in June, because I know the door was open, but the screen door was there. She knocks on the screen door, and my mother looks up, and I'm standing there grabbing this cookie, and Barbara says, Sophia, I need some help. And I watch my mother kind of throw her brush into the bucket and stand up, grimace a little bit, and say, sure, Barbara, let's go. I gotta say, I mean, I was very devout as a Greek Orthodox up till then, and even for another 7 years. Not just going to church every Sunday, teaching Sunday school, I memorized the liturgy in ancient Greek. I mean, it's all of that stuff. But that was the moment in which I learned what it meant to be a good person. It wasn't through all the rest of it. It was that moment, watching my mother. So sometimes it happens through role modeling. Sometimes it's a teacher, coach, an early manager. Later in life, it could be a partner or spouse. And sometimes it's people who believe in your strengths and give you a chance that you didn't think you were up for. Now, why is this so critical? It's because when we do the research, we ask the converse question. Tell us about anybody in the last 2 years who's tried to help you. Now, by implication, it didn't work quite. So any manager doing a performance review, any trainer, coach, priest, minister, imam, rabbi, anybody. And people come back to us, 67% of the stories come back. Boom, they give me data about how I'm coming across. Boom, they feed me some data about how I'm acting. And then they immediately go to say, boom, I can help you with that attitude problem you have. Boom, boom, I can help you with your team issue. Boom, 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 I can help you be a better performer. And how do you feel? Like you've been punched. Because regardless of why they're doing it, you've just had an encounter with a bully. And I think that's because inside of each one of us, and I'm not going to spend time tonight because I only have an hour, not 3 days, but this is a fractal. So this is true in every one of our dyad relationships, our pairs, our teams, our organizations, our communities, and our countries. But let's stay at the individual level. There's a positive and negative emotional attractor. It comes out of complexity theory. These are strange attractors. If you read about complexity, they don't pull you into them, they pull you around them. Being in the positive emotional attractor is being in the renewal and being in the empathic neural network. Being in the negative emotional attractor is being in the stress response and the analytic neural network. This is having negative thoughts, this is having positive thoughts. This is thinking about possibilities versus problems, dreams versus expectations. I love this one. Optimism versus pessimism. Optimists call themselves optimists. What do pessimists call themselves? This is thinking about hope versus fear, strengths versus weaknesses, excited about trying something versus a performance improvement plan. This is novelty versus obligation, resonant versus dissonant relationships. The most important thing that this entire past 30 years of research has led us to is these two propositions. Sustained desired change starts in the positive emotional attractor. It does not start in the negative emotional attractor. Why? Because if you start in the negative emotional attractor, it's a bummer, and the person goes into a defensive mode. When I was treating alcoholics and drug addicts during the 70s, I knew if all they wanted to do was stay sober and clean, which they had to, but if that was all they wanted to do, they'd be back using in 6 months. They needed something bigger. This is why people who try to lose weight can't. It's negatively framed. This is why treatment adherence. See, everything in this approach is, we're doing the research with physicians as well. Why is treatment adherence for type 2 diabetes? That means how much do patients who are diagnosed do what their doctors, their physicians, or the nurses tell them to do? Which for type 2 diabetes is exercise more, lose weight, and eat these foods. Those are the three things. Treatment adherence is 50% in every country where it's measured. For orthopedic surgery, you break an ankle, knee replacement, do you do the things in rehab that your physician or nurse tells you to do? Documented treatment adherence, 50%. Now, lest you think those aren't serious enough, my friends who are cardiothoracic surgeons tell me that treatment adherence has been documented for coronary bypass patients at 20%. Why do people who are smart, otherwise savvy, not do what they should do? Because the way the physicians and nurses bring it to us. So if you have never been diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic, sacrifice a goat, thank your gods. But if you have, this is what happens. They say, okay, you've got to exercise more, lose weight, and eat these foods. And if you don't, we're going to have to, and your A1C goes above 6.5, we're going to have to put you on sugar suppressants like metformin. And if that doesn't work and your A1C stays up there or goes up, we're going to have to start you on insulin. And if that doesn't work, we're going to have to increase the dosage. And if that doesn't work, chances are you're going to get neuropathy. The nerves in your feet are going to start to go, and you're either going to feel constant pain or nothing. And at that point, for your survival, we have to amputate your feet. And then we start amputating moving up because of the neuropathy. Isn't that exciting? Isn't that motivating? So here's why people don't do what their physicians or nurses tell them to do. Because physicians and nurses try to scare the crap out of you. And it closes you down. Now, let's be clear about this. Constructive criticism is still criticism. Doesn't matter your intent. The person receiving it still feels like you're being a bully. So if you're in HR, a consultant, or a manager, and you want to get somebody to change, and you could see what they're doing wrong, but you want to help them change, keep it to yourself. Because if you tell them, if you come up with some sophisticated assessments to force them to see it, what you're doing is further entrenching them in the resistance and the negative emotional attractor. They're closed down. So you've done worse by telling them. So if you want to get revenge on somebody, give them feedback. Give them critical feedback. Help them. If you want to vomit on them, do that. But if you really want to incite some possible change, do it the way it worked for you. Start in the positive emotional attractor. And what happens is you start to open up, and then you're ready for some adaptation. What am I saying here? Yes, more of this. Negative emotions are stronger than positive, not better, for good ecological reasons. I call this survive and thrive. We need both. You wouldn't have woken up today if you didn't go into a negative emotional attractor state. You couldn't have woken up. You have to solve a problem periodically. But what happens is, if you stayed there, you shut down. So if we want to help somebody learn or change, we need to open up the positive emotional attractor. So my colleagues and I in 2002 started calling this coaching for compliance versus coaching with compassion, using a more Confucian interpretation of compassion, of Jin, both hedonic and eudaimonic. Am I caring about the person and what they want to do, or am I telling them what to do? You know how your in-laws tell you how to dress your kids, even when they're in their 50s? It doesn't work. It doesn't work just because you are well-intended. It doesn't work because you lay out and put them through an assessment center. It doesn't work. So to get a balance, we need to have more sampling of the PEA in any given day. And that's the key. If you had 60 minutes to go into renewal, into the PEA tomorrow, which you wouldn't, you have a lot more time than that. But if you only had 60 minutes, it's better to do 15 minutes at 4 different times in the day than 1 hour at lunch. And research that I am about to publish, based on a number of studies we did, shows that the more different things you use each week increases your sense of well-being, your empathy, your engagement, your career satisfaction, increases your empathic feelings, decreases your sense of distress, depression, etc.